Welcome back to Chain Reaction, the Foreign Policy Research Institute's flagship network of podcast series examining the political, security, economic, and social trends shaping our world. Throughout the year, we'll be talking with experts about developments in Russia's war in Ukraine, the new European security order, defense and geopolitical issues in the Baltic states, as well as current and future national security challenges and opportunities in the technology and space sectors. Join us each month for
Bear Market Brief,
Behind the Front,
Baltic Ways,
Report in Short,
The Ties That Bind, NATO Allies in Action. New episodes are available each week on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and most streaming services. To be the first to know about new releases, you can subscribe to FPRI's Insights newsletter. That's fprinsights.substack.com, or follow the link available in the description of this episode. Thanks for joining us. This week on the continent.
As the year starts to wind down and we take stock of all that's happened over the last 12 months, a certain quote comes to mind. There are decades where nothing happens and weeks where decades happen. That quote, by the way, is often associated with Vladimir Lenin. Evidence for that is scant. But big picture here, you don't need to be a political scientist to know and to feel that the world is moving awfully fast. My name is Aaron Schwartzbaum, and this is The Continent, a podcast about the intersection of politics and security and economics and society in Europe in the wake of Russia's most recent invasion of Ukraine. Now, this is going to be an unusual episode because we'll really be looking at U.S. policy, but U.S. policy that has tremendous implications for Europe. I'm trying to understand how the U.S. can navigate a changing global order, and in particular, a more multipolar world. Here is the bias disclaimer. I tend to run in a foreign policy circle that's more skeptical of U.S. power, and so does our guest. I'm not trying to convince you of anything, but that's the frame with which I approached this conversation, and I want you to be aware of it. So let's introduce our illustrious guest who just wrote a really fascinating book. Emma Ashford is a senior fellow with the Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy program at the Stimson Center, a columnist at Foreign Policy, and the author of First Among Equals, U.S. Foreign Policy for a Multipolar World from Yale University Press. I will include a link to that book in the description. Well worth the read. So let's turn to it. Apologies for any rogue sniffles. Had a bit of a cold at the time, but this was a great conversation. Emma, thank you so much for dropping by The Continent. Let's kick this off with the basic introduction question. I was wondering, what's keeping you busy these days?
Yeah, so thanks so much for having me. I work over at the Stimson Center, and what I'm mostly doing at the moment is actually book promotion for, I think, the book that we're going to talk about today. But I did also want to flag that we've just done a related project to the book at Stimson, the Grand Strategy Project, in which we basically tried to pull together 10 different essays from all the different parts of the sort of foreign policy spectrum of opinion about their visions for the future of U.S. foreign policy. So if folks are interested, they can find that on the Stimson website. And I think it's just this really fascinating look into what people are thinking these days.
Well, we will include links to both the book and that project in the description of this podcast. Encourage folks to read the book. I got to for this podcast, and it was rather engaging, as you will hear as we get into the content today. So my first question is, what was your specific impetus to write this book? Obviously, the world is evolving in interesting directions, seemingly daily, seemingly hourly. Was it just the broad feeling about what's happening globally? Was it a conversation, a specific eureka moment? How did this come to you?
I think it was probably two things. I mean, so one was that I kept getting asked questions when I would talk to students or visiting groups, and I would feel like I was kind of repeating myself a lot, like I was saying the same things, but I'd never really written it down anywhere. And so I thought, well, maybe I should actually try and write something that is a little more comprehensive about how I think the world works. And then that can, at the least it's helpful for me in sort of backstopping my own arguments. But then I think the second part of this was, this book was written primarily in the back half of the Biden administration, but Trump is re-entering the picture. We've had the first Trump administration. And I've long been fascinated by this question of, how we navigate this period of flux in US foreign policy. And I think by the time I started writing this, it had become very apparent that Biden was not going to snap us back to some pre-Trump norm in foreign policy, that we were having change. And so, that was part of what I wanted to explore here.
Makes a lot of sense. I certainly, it sounds like you've written down things that I've certainly talked about in many a happy hour down in DC visits. But yeah, great to have this framework around it that we will be exploring over the rest of this conversation. So let's talk about the big picture in the book. So there's kind of two halves, broadly speaking. There's the, I don't know if diagnosis is the right word, but the kind of prescription of like what are the different foreign policy viewpoints broadly, and then here are some things we could do within one of those viewpoints. So I want, if you could help listeners understand the four square, kind of like the kids game at the schoolyard, the four squares of foreign policy and how they break down. And I think what would be helpful for listeners is a sense of a sentence. You might be in this square if you think X, Y, Z.
Yeah, so I have this chapter in the book, as you say, where I talk about basically the spectrum of foreign policy opinion in Washington. And I actually took as my model for this, Barry Posen and Andrew Ross did this article back in 1992 where they laid out sort of the spectrum of emerging post-Cold War opinions on grand strategy. And so I tried to do something similar here, which was sort of look around the community in DC and say, well, what are people talking about? What has changed? Are there camps that seem to be emerging? And as you say, I end up with this four square because every political scientist loves a 2x2. But basically four groups, right? So the two bigger groups are what I call the liberal order primacists. That's, in a nutshell, the Biden folks, right? You probably belong in that box if you think the US, should remain the indispensable nation. We should have significant alliances around the world, and the protection of liberal order is sort of the goal of US foreign policy. In the next box over, again, kind of a major group, we have this emerging Trumpian, Jacksonian, America first opinion. Now, they still really like the military and they still really like the use of force, but they are almost defined by their focus on sovereignty, US interests, and US interests above almost anything else, right? So they literally don't think liberal order exists. And so that's a very interesting distinction. And then I have two other groups that are less central to the policy conversation, but I think still shaping the dialogue in important ways. One is this progressive movement on the left of the Democratic Party. They've been very influential in domestic politics, but they're starting to talk about foreign policy and have been for a little while. And, that group tends to be very focused on things like human rights, development, trying to help other people around the world. But they're also pretty gun shy, right? They don't want to use the military. They don't want the US to be an empire. So there's, that's kind of an interesting dichotomy for them. The final group, with the one with which I identify, is this sort of mixed group of folks that are realists, maybe some prioritizers in the current lingo, and restrainers, right? So folks that want the US to do less militarily around the world, but to do so from the point of view of US interests primarily. And so you can kind of break those groups down in different ways. You can see how they might ally with one another on specific issues, but that's kind of the framework that I ended up coming up with.
So I want to ask, and I hope it's not too personal to ask, you said it yourself, identify more as a realist restrainer in that category, and the back half of the book is about that kind of worldview. How did you arrive at that position? Talk to me about like your genesis as a foreign policy person, and like how you arrived there specifically, if that's okay to ask.
Absolutely, yeah. I know I've said this in sort of talks and things. I'm not sure if I've ever said it on a podcast or anything before. No, when I was 17, 18 and getting interested in foreign policy. This was 2002, 2003. I thought, the use of force was great. I thought invading Iraq was going to be a great idea. Everything was going to go wonderfully. Now, I was young. I was very stupid. I really believed all the things I was told. And I think like a lot of my generation, our generation, I think, I ended up coming away much more skeptical about what the US can really achieve in the world. And then obviously, as I went through college and grad school and I got exposed to a much broader set of ideas, not just what I heard from leaders on TV, I discovered that there's these really deep veins of philosophical thought about how states pursue their foreign policy, how they best serve the interests of the people that live within the state. And I ended up, I think I identified much more with this realist school, which tends to be naturally cautious about what you do in the world.
Yeah, I just always there's a lot of this discussion strikes me as always people citing what articles they like most, unless they're like personal experience, which I think is important in the kind of formulation of a lot of these ideas. So fascinating to hear. Let's do something a little self-indulgent for me, dabbling in some international relations theory. I have a problem. I like talking about it. So you talk about that there are motivations for these schools broadly. Some are more values driven, some are more interests driven. But you also talk about risks for each school and this idea of a deterrence model versus a spiral model. Now, I happen to be familiar with those, but I reckon we have some people listening who are not familiar. Let's talk about how conflict and war tends to kick off in the literature.
So this was something that in many ways started to bug me over the last 5 or so years. As I would have conversations with other folks in DC, I would realize that we were effectively arguing over an article of faith. And that was whether you think the deterrence model predominates or the spiral model predominates. Now, these two models, right? So, one, the spiral model is this notion that states end up in conflict unintentionally, right? That one state builds up its arms because it's fearful of the other, but the other state just thinks it's building up its arms, so it responds. And then the first state builds up more, and you end up in this spiral towards conflict that's very hard to stop, even though neither side really wants it. That's the spiral model. The deterrence model is a lot simpler. The deterrence model basically is that you build up as much force as you possibly can, because the stronger you look, the less likely you are to be attacked. And that will dissuade your opponent from doing it. And you can see how these are fundamentally opposed, right? Bob Jervis's classic book, Perception and Misperception in International Politics, spends a lot of time on this, right? If you think you're in the spiral model, but you're actually in the deterrence model, it doesn't work. And if you think you're in the deterrence model and you're actually in the spiral model, it's going to be war. And so for me, I found that even in these very practical conversations in DC about like, how do you handle Iran? People would basically be arguing from one of these two viewpoints. Now, for me, I tend to think that the spiral model predominates, but I see how people who believe in that deterrence model, I see how they get to their policy prescriptions as a result.
Yeah, and I think if I remember correctly, back in the literature in my undergrad and I guess grad days too, was like World War One was kind of the classic spiral model example, and World War Two was used as the more like the deterrence example. So we're not here to tell you how to think about it, but these are two frameworks on top of the four categories that you might fall into. You might think about as you think about what ought the U.S. do.
Yeah. So, look, I mean, this is, I think, the big question, right? And most of the reason why I wrote this book, because I think, we have had these, again, very active debates on foreign policy for, I mean, much of the last decade at this point. A lot of it centered around, how we end the war on terror or don't. But I think we're now in a place where the questions about the US role in the world are bigger than just the war on terror, right? It is, as other countries are rising, should the US, I mean, in effect, I think, should the US put the pedal to the metal, spend a bunch more money, beef up its military forces, engage more militarily overseas, try to sustain US military primacy? Or should we try to find something short of that? Right? Do we find a way to dial back some of the commitments we've made in the last 30 years that were so ambitious? Do we find a way to live a more modest foreign policy? Do we try to become, so I quote in the opening to the book, Jean Kirkpatrick's essay from 1992, post-Cold War, which he advocated the US should become a normal nation in a normal time. And so I think to some extent, that's what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to offer one roadmap for a way in which the United States can become, an important country in the world, but more of a normal nation and less of an indispensable one.
So that is the perfect segue to the question I wanted to ask next, which concerns multipolarity and the kind of characteristics of the international system. So I think it's been floated quite a bit in popular coverage and discussions in foreign policy broadly that the world is increasingly multipolar. This is less the U.S. unipolar moment where we get to call the shots everywhere, and there are new kids on the block who want to throw their weight around in various capacities. Maybe even bipolar again, China versus the U.S. Lots of thought there. But I'm curious, like, how do multipolar orders work in practice? What would we expect to see as far as the US presumably not being able to do things it formerly enjoyed? Like, what does that look like? How do you know you're in a multipolar order?
Well, it's really hard. And what I discovered, so I went back and dug through a whole bunch of the academic literature on polarity from the 50s and 60s. And what I discovered is that all these greats of the field couldn't agree on what polarity we were in at key points in history either, right? I think it was like 1938 is defined as like 4 different systems by different scholars. So this is difficult. For me, what makes this a multipolar system that is emerging, what I think is a multipolar system, is that in addition to the US and China, two really quite large powers sort of out ahead of the pack, we also have a variety of states that are, you might call them middle powers, second tier great powers, regional powers, right? Everything from Russia, Australia, North Korea, who are able to influence things in their regions, maybe even to go toe to toe with US or China in their own region. And the superpowers, the great powers, whatever you want to call them, have to work with these states in those regions to get what they want. And to me, that's what makes it multipolar instead of just this purely bipolar system. The Cold War looked very different. It was much more rigid, certainly inside the Euro-Atlantic and even Asian sphere. So this is what scholars call unbalanced multipolarity. People might tend to think of multipolarity as being like 4 or 5 powers and they all look the same and it's like continental Europe in the Napoleonic period. That's actually relatively unusual in history. Most of history has been multipolar and often it's been quite unbalanced.
So as far as cooperating with these middle powers would be offensive to people in the middle powers, but these more regional powers, these major powers, I think is one of the words you used. So what would that look like if I could still see in a multipolar order the U.S. launching perhaps not a good example, but like a Somalia operation intervening in a further flung poorer country. What would be the change? Like what would be something that the United States government would not be able to do by itself anymore?
Yeah, I'm not sure. So Somalia might not actually be a great example because I'm not sure in Africa we have a power yet that can really achieve this level. Maybe in the next 30 years. But let me give you a different example. So if we think about, let's say Turkey and India in the context of the U.S. war in Ukraine, the U.S. has been able to work with both countries to try and boost some of its policies in the war. So, in the case of Turkey, right, the US managed to get Turkey to use its special privileges to block Russian access in and out of the Black Sea. And that's been a huge benefit to the Ukrainians and to the US in this context. But at the same time, they've not been able to stop Turkey from buying a bunch of Russian oil and maybe working with the Russians on some technology stuff. The Turks are playing both sides. And the US hasn't been able to prevent that. And indeed, in many ways, we've sort of accepted that because we know that that's the way we get the bits we want. And you could make similar arguments about India in terms of, again, they're selling weapons to one side, they're buying weapons from the Russians, the oil question is there. So those are sort of two examples where I think you can see these middle powers, you're right, I shouldn't use middle powers, but they are placing constraints on the US in this context at the same time as we can work with them to try and achieve some of our goals.
So we talked about the US and what we're less able to do. We're also talking about book title, First Among Equals. There are the other equals, definitely China, Russia, maybe Russia can definitely you can see Emma if you can't see the conversation, but was giving the kind of wavering hand, maybe not. But the question is what we might expect in a multipolar order to see from the larger powers that were used to be constrained by the US. So, what would we expect from Russia and China in a world where the US doesn't get to be the sole veto holder rule maker? How are they going to behave?
Well, so this is actually one of the interesting things about this is I think if you look at particularly the Chinese, but also the Russians increasingly over the last decade or so, they've very much been pursuing a strategy that I think is a pretty good fit for multipolarity. And that is um, building as many connections as they can all over the place, not worrying too much about the depth of those connections, but trying to prioritize. So, for example, they're going to buy a bunch of oil from the Gulf states, right? They transitioned China from just Iran in the region and taking aside, they transitioned to having good commercial partnerships with basically all the Gulf states. So now in the Middle East, they're connected to everyone. They're doing the same thing with sort of some of the Belt and Road initiatives. They've not been hugely successful, but into Central Asia, right? They want Chinese businesses to be, if not necessarily a first choice in some places where the Russians are, a second choice for these countries. And they've even done that reaching into sort of Latin America and elsewhere. The US, on the other hand, has pursued a much more, let's say, black or white strategy, right? We want the world to have a clean dividing line through it. We're not comfortable with ambiguity. We're not comfortable with states that don't want to join NATO or join Russia. We want to try and pull states into our orbit in a more holistic sense. And so, to me, these are actually two very different strategies the powers are using to try and cope with this world. One is trying to force it back into bipolarity. The other is, embracing the multipolarity part of it. And I worry that the one the Chinese and Russians are using is the better strategy.
There was, I forgot where the quote was from or who said it. I believe it was from Kenya, but definitely from an African country. The line that when the Americans visit, we get a lecture, and when the Chinese visit, we get a school. It was akin to that. So
Yeah, that's always been some of the arguments that the US should give up its values when it interacts overseas. I do think it goes even a little deeper than that here, though. I think, again, the US really has been pushing in recent years. If you look at, the Quad, right? We want the Quad to become an alliance when the other states in it don't. They mostly want it to be, again, this flexible thing that we use to try and manage China. So it's not even just the values question. I think it's about structure and about flexibility.
So before I turn to our final question, I have a penultimate one that's come up in our conversation. I think this is the Continent Podcast. We would be remiss not to talk about your vision for Europe and why you think that vision is the right vision. So let's talk about your prescription for how the US behaves with regards to Europe going forward.
I guess I'll start by caveating this and saying when I wrote this, right, there's this gap between writing a book and it getting printed. When I wrote this, I was worried it was radical and it was going to get shot down in flames. And since it went to the printer, it has moved much closer to US government policy in ways that I find surprising, but I think to me confirmed that this is a viable approach. So I argue in the book for a phased US military retrenchment from Europe over a period of, let's say, 5 to 15 years, but some of it starting pretty soon. The idea that NATO should become Europeanized. The idea that, the US doesn't necessarily need to withdraw from the alliance, but we need to become the last resort instead of the first resort. That means no US tripwire forces in the Baltics. That means European states providing those forces, those capabilities, and the US focusing elsewhere. And as I say, this in many ways almost sounds like, well, this is the path we're heading down now. But I think, again, even 3 years ago, this would have been sort of seen as just something that was not possible. And I think what we've seen in the last 6-9 months with Trump has been to open the Overton window all the way. And now this is something we're actually talking about.
So I guess the way I think about a lot of political risk questions is these signposts. So as we look at the evolution of relations, the transatlantic relations, what are we looking for as far as signposts, indicators that our relationship with Europe is evolving in a certain direction, that we are beginning to retrench, or that we're not. I've seen talk that Europe, talk writing analysis goes much further than that. Seen talk that the question of Europe kind of charting its own course may lead to Europe not going along with U.S. interests at times if we're not the first line of defense. So what are we looking for? Key signs, indicators of the broad geopolitical direction? Let's zoom back up to that higher level question.
This is such a great question, though. And actually, it's a bit of a tangent to the book, but we actually did a foresight exercise that I ran out of Stimson last year, trying to, do back casting to figure out, if we made it to European defense, what would it look like? How would we have gotten there? And it threw up some really interesting stuff. I mean, so in the near term here, right? I mean, we want to see European states increasing their spending. We are actually seeing that. We also want to see spending on concrete capabilities that can actually be used to replace US capabilities. And I think that's where we have not yet seen this approach. On the US side, obviously, we would want to see actually concrete steps towards withdrawing some initial forces from Europe, right, to make this credible. A lot of folks talk about US retrenchment from Europe as if it's kind of all in or all out. But actually, we want to start talking about, well, take out some infantry, right, that can be replaced fairly easily by infantry from European countries, right? So there are places where, you start the process, and we would want to see that as a visible sign. And again, we've not seen that yet. So I'm cautious. In the medium to long term, though, I think, the signposts for what we would want to see for an independent Europe, they start to diverge a lot, right? You could imagine one world in which this US retrenchment continues some of the trends that we've seen in actually pushing European states together, right? The EU in particular works best in a crisis. Some of the financing mechanisms that we've seen with the European Union over the last year or two, for purchasing equipment, maybe we'll start to talk about joint training, things like that. So a more unified Europe emerging, that would be one of these longer term signposts. On the other hand, I think there is also an equally plausible world in which the retrenchment actually starts to drive divergence in European states. And instead of, coming together, we see the Poles, the Balts, working together in smaller groupings, minilaterals, to try and achieve the things that they're not able to push through at the European level. And again, I think we've seen some signs that might be happening, right? We've seen these states start to talk about, can they build some sort of common defense? The Poles, they're using EU funding, but they're probably only in it for the first year. So again, I think we do not know yet which way this will go. But those are kind of the signposts that I'm looking for in the sort of 3 to 5 year time window.
So essentially a moment where Europe could turn to the US and say no. And that'd be a huge, huge turn.
I mean, look, I also should be clear. Europe says no to the US all the time. Now, maybe they do so subtly. Maybe they try to persuade us. My general stance is that I don't fear Europe suddenly deciding that it's never going to back the US again. I don't particularly fear it siding with China over the US any more than it was already. And so for me, I don't think this is really about, I don't think we're losing a lot in terms of control over Europe, which we never really had. I think we're just preserving our own flexibility in other ways.
So I'm very nervous about saying how long ago some of these conversations happened on this podcast, because after COVID, my ability to tell how long things have been, relative time, has been completely fried. But at one point, I spoke with Stephen Wertheim, and it was a great conversation. And we spoke about ways of thinking about U.S. interests, core interests. And now I'm fortunate enough to have another U.S. foreign policy expert with us on this podcast. So I want to ask you, what are our, as the U.S., core interests? What actually matters?
My favorite negative review of the book so far, and there have been a number, is the one where the author accused me of saying nothing novel about US interests because I didn't suggest any new US interests. And to me, I think that's hilarious because it misses, I think, the entire point of the argument that I make in the book, which is over the last 30 years, US interests have grown and grown and grown. They've become everything from, preventing the spread of nuclear weapons, to protecting human rights in Libya, to promoting LGBTQ in Uganda, to, trade relations with Vietnam, but you can see just how broad these things are. So one of the things I actually argue in the book is we should be thinking about US interests much more narrowly. And for me, I would scope them extremely narrowly. I would say the security of the US homeland, not necessarily all US allies as currently construed, but the US homeland, the security and prosperity of the American people, right? So we want to be able to travel freely abroad. We want to be able to sustain our economic way of life. We want to be able to trade if that's what the current government doesn't seem to care. But, that's, I think, what most Americans want. We want to be able to interact. We want our ships and our merchants to have freedom of access around the world. And we want to avoid great power war, particularly one that could rise to the nuclear level. For me, that's a pretty narrow, discrete set of interests. I think it's achievable, where I think a lot of these other interests either aren't achievable or aren't always achievable, in that we have to start thinking about trade-offs. So, one trade-off for me, for example, in the nuclear proliferation space would be, does extending the US nuclear umbrella, right? Maybe it means there's less proliferation, but maybe it increases the risk of nuclear exchange with another great power, right? That's a hell of a trade-off, and we should be very clear that US interests might not just be in preventing one or the other of those things.
Great way of thinking about it. I think that covers the turf I was hoping to today. Thank you so much for coming by. I learned a lot, and I hope you listeners did too. Again, links to the project on foreign policy thinking, and most importantly, this book in the episode description. Thank you again to Emma, and to you, dear listener, for joining. The question I want to leave you with, especially if you're American, but not necessarily, what foreign policy camp do you see yourself in? Why do you think that's the right camp? Why do you think that camp's prescriptions are correct given our interests, or U.S. interests? What might be drawbacks to that camp's prescriptions? What dangers lie with that? Have a thought. While you start thinking, the Continent Podcast is brought to you by the Foreign Policy Research Institute, that's FPRI, a nonpartisan think tank based in Philadelphia. For more information on this initiative and on many others, visit fpri.org.